Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. The new Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte has given his first State of the Nation address just 4 weeks into the job. In a speech lasting nearly 2 hours, the former mayor of Davao City broke with the tradition, delivering the majority of his speech in English instead of Tagalog, laying out the platform of eradicating criminality, illegal drugs and corruption in government. But he made only a passing reference to the dispute that the country has with China over the South China Sea, while giving his thoughts on other pressing problems facing the nation in much greater detail. So what impact is the new president making on Filipino society? And equally, how will his new administration be viewed overseas, not just in the Chinese capital, but also among traditional allies, such as the United States of America? I'm happy to be joined here in the Beijing studio by Professor James Ray from California State University and Jia Xiudong, Senior Research Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. We shall also be crossing over to Professor Richard Hidarian at the La Salle University in Manila for his comments. But before we get started, let's take a look at this.
It was perhaps the clearest indication yet from Manila that it is looking to work with Beijing, not against it. On Monday, the new Philippine President, Rodrigo Duterte, said the two countries will cooperate bilaterally to resolve their differences in the South China Sea.
We shall deepen security dialogues with other nations to build greater understanding and cooperation.
He said his case was bolstered by a court finding 2 weeks ago, rejected by Beijing, that appeared to validate Manila's claims over some of the waters and the islands there. Now he's appointed former President Fidel Ramos to act as a special envoy to Beijing. During the ASEAN +1 meeting, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi also called for tensions in the South China Sea to be eased.
China believes the page of the deeply flawed and inconsistent arbitration tribunal ruling that severely lacks legitimacy has been turned. Therefore, the temperature of the hype brought by the tribunal case should be lowered, and the solution to the South China Sea issue should be rectified and returned to the right track.
Duterte said his country can benefit if it's able to settle its South China Sea disputes with China. He cited his plan to establish industrial zones and improve the transport infrastructure across the country.
And if you want a joint venture, fine, to get the gases and the gas and oil. Okay.
On Wednesday, the American Secretary of State, John Kerry, will meet with Duterte and his Foreign Secretary.
What is Secretary of State Kerry here for? It's not the economics part. It is the security part for sure. It's quite unstable for the Americans to look at Mutual Defense Treaty, the EDCA, upon which they base their pivot to Asia, has suddenly become a bit unstable.
It'll be the highest level meeting between Washington and Manila since Duterte took office. US officials say the two will discuss a full range of issues.
Gentlemen, are you surprised that President Duterte has been able to draft a new policy option with regard to China over the South China Sea, of course? What do you think of his reconciliatory tone?
Well, it seems somewhat of a shift since 1992 when the U.S. forces and Air Force and naval bases in Philippines left under a nationalist movement. The U.S. has been very close to the Philippines since then. I think particularly the last two presidential administrations of Macapagal Arroyo and Aquino, very close to the United States. So I think Duterte has laid out a more neutral stance that might be more accommodating to China, and I think that's partially why we see Secretary Kerry visiting to make sure the Philippines and the U.S. are on the same page.
Xiudong, are you convinced that the campaign success of President Duterte will be a game changer in the South China Sea dispute?
President Duterte's primary focus is his domestic agenda. So he would like to create a kind of favorable conditions, also external conditions for his domestic agenda. So I believe that that actually will help him bring his attention to improved Philippine-China relations instead of the tensions which was caused by the former administration of the Philippines.
His State of the Union speech, the first of its kind since he took office, took place in the wake of the joint statement that was issued jointly by China and ASEAN member states in Vientiane, the capital city of Laos. What do you think of the consensus, if any, between and among member states of ASEAN in pushing aside the issue of South China Sea, particularly the ruling of The Hague, while working together in, for example, ensuring freedom of navigation in the overflight?
Well, I think for the past few years we've seen where China has good friends in ASEAN like Cambodia who will articulate China's foreign policy position in the body, and then that's a body that needs consensus. I think we would have known if the Philippines had been unhappy about the reluctance to put any message into the ASEAN statement. And so I think Duterte's statements have mirrored what came out of ASEAN, that does not want a confrontational stance toward China, wants negotiations and dialogue. So I think we see ASEAN as, again, a useful vehicle, and the Philippines not apparently taking a confrontational approach with this new president.
And do you think, Mr. Jia, that the joint statement by both the ASEAN as a regional bloc and jointly by China and ASEAN should be the second chapter that prevailed in China's favor, and the page is over about the ruling?
Yes, I believe that de-escalation of tensions in the South China Sea is the order of the day for both China and the ASEAN, and that's why they would like actually to leave the episode of the arbitration behind, so that they can move forward on areas of common interest for China ASEAN. That includes actually the priorities of the Filipino administration under the leadership of President Duterte.
Lurking behind the scenario, I'm afraid, is the U.S. government. Of course, he's going to meet, President Duterte is going to meet with the Secretary of State John Kerry, addressing a number of issues, including, of course, the aftermath of the ruling. What do you think of the campaign pledges by President Duterte during the campaign that he somehow did not quite trust the security guarantees by the U.S. government? And do you think that will somehow upset the policymakers in Washington?
Well, I think the United States wants the Philippines to follow the previous administration's foreign policy and be in lockstep with the U.S. on issues of the South China Sea. And with this tribunal ruling, I don't think the U.S. wishes to see the Philippines completely walk away from the ruling and really reach out to China. So I think the U.S. will counsel the Philippines on the necessity of maintaining a close strategic relationship to the United States.
But obviously, the Duterte administration wants deliberately to keep a distance from the tough policy of Washington regarding South China Sea. Do you think skirmishes are likely to occur between Manila and Washington? Do you think Washington is instead also ready to have peaceful negotiations instead of going further down the road of confrontation?
Actually, Washington is quite actually concerned about the shift of President Duterte's foreign policy, especially towards China, because President Duterte would like to change the confrontational approach taken by former President Aquino towards China. But President Duterte also knows the importance of the Philippines' alliance with the United States. So he would like to actually strike a kind of balance between the relationship with the United States, relationship with China. And I believe that he realized that the relationship with China is very important for even his domestic agenda. The previous approach taken by President Aquino actually did kind of disservice to the interests of the Philippines.
Well, do you guys believe that how big the distance he keeps from Washington largely depends on the deal that China could grant? For example, this new administration, President Duterte, really wants to have a heavy investment in the construction of a railway network across the Philippines. But that's a little bit too much, perhaps. On the other hand, there's a strong voice. When China is spending so heavily on the blueprint of One Belt, One Road initiative in other parts of Asia, for example, in Central Asia and other developing countries along the stretches of the Belt and Road initiative, why shouldn't China spend equally the same amount of money constructing infrastructure for the new administration so that the two governments can really work together instead of working against each other?
Well, I think other Southeast Asian countries that are close to the United States or close to China have found it's beneficial to encourage the U.S. to play a diplomatic or strategic role, encourage China to play an economic and diplomatic role, and be able to balance the two and gain investment and trade opportunities. But the Philippines, because of its closeness to the United States and its geographic distance from China, I think hasn't benefited, as Xiaodong said. And so I think it would be beneficial for the Philippines to centralize, in a sense, their position between the U.S. and China. And that will lead to some antagonism or some nervousness in the United States, but I think it will benefit Philippines because we know China is going to have much more opportunities to invest in Southeast Asia than the United States has thus far been able to.
I'm afraid many policymakers in the DC and in Tokyo would be very, very sorry to see the formation of a neutrality between and among member states of ASEAN, the regional bloc. Let me cross over to Richard Hidarian, a scholar from Manila, for his comments on how he looks at some of the pressing problems that President Duterte spoke of in his State of the Union speech, the first of its kind since he took office. Hello, Richard. Hi, Richard.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Right. What do you think are the most pressing problems for your new president?
I hope I can hear you well. I hope you can also hear me. Well, as far as I think President Duterte is concerned, at this point, much of his political capital is focused on fighting the issue of crime and the proliferation of drugs. And if you look at the State of the Nation address, he spent tremendous amount of time on trying to justify his no-nonsense and uncompromising approach to this issue. And he also tried to provide a different conception of human rights by putting human rights in the context of national interest and collective values. So I think this is where he's going to put much of his political capital, while his discussion on foreign policy and particularly on South China Sea was extremely minimal. I think the reason why he had a very minimal discussion on that was because he wanted to make sure that the communication with China will not be compromised by trying to pander to nationalist, patriotic emotions at home. And the other thing is bilateral negotiations with China are set to start soon with the selection of former President Fidel Ramos as a special envoy. So I think he realizes at this point the best form of communication is perhaps silence and not to say much, because it's a very tricky and very sensitive issue. And there are many people in the Philippines who have passions against China and want the Philippines to use the verdict from The Hague to embarrass and confront China. But clearly that is not the approach that Duterte wants. Duterte wants to approach China and the South China Sea issue in a much more deliberate, self-restrained, and calibrated way, and try to resolve the issue through bilateral engagement with China. And that is why we saw he's not making a lot of mention of the South China Sea issue, while much of his discussion has been focused on the domestic war on crime and proliferation of drugs.
Certainly, there's a newly elected president who wants to live up to the expectations of his electorate. But by the way, James and Xiaodong, don't you think he runs the risk of having a showdown with the Catholic Church because he vows to reinstate the death penalty and he wants to bring back the draconian family planning policy? Both cases threaten to antagonize the traditional bottom line of the Catholic Church. And by the way, the Philippines boasts of a large following of churchgoers.
Well, in his State of the Nation, he said that the Philippine people, the state and the church should be separate, but God and the state could be together. I think that was suggesting that he would not be under the authority of the Catholic Church. And I think in the Philippines, the elites that he's run against and called for investigations of corruption also mirrors some of the elites of the Catholic Church. And I think even though most Filipinos are Catholic, I think they recognize the church is an institution that is more controlled by powerful figures in the society. And so I think there may be some criticism of his policies, but I don't think he's worried about that because I think the public supports most of his heavy-handed approach to law and order and crime and even some of the social issues.
Thank you very much. Let me get back to Richard. Hi, Richard. Richard, do you think your president, Mr. Duterte, is ready to fight two wars on two fronts? On the one hand, he's going to jeopardize his power base by declaring war on drug cartels, drug lords, and drug pushers. On the other hand, he's going to have a showdown with the Catholic Church. Do you think he's going to win the war, or instead he's going to only win some of the battles?
Well, I mean, without the question, Duterte is the most powerful Filipino president since the former dictator Marcos. 91% of Filipinos have expressed confidence and trust in him. He has a supermajority support in both houses of the Congress. He's set to appoint much of the bulk of the Philippine Supreme Court justices in the coming years. So he has a lot of political capital. But I think the problem with him is that, first of all, he has imposed a deadline on himself. He said that within the first 6 months of his office, he's going to suppress crime and criminality and proliferation of drugs. And I think that is why he's dedicating so much political capital to this issue. Although so far the opposition to him has been quite muted. You only have few legislators and a Catholic Church that is no longer that influential who have been opposing him on this issue. But I think down the line there'll be more and more controversy and opposition. But at the same time, he's also launching a peace offensive, not a war, when it comes to insurgency groups. So during his State of the Nation address, he unilaterally declared a ceasefire with the communist rebels who have been fighting the Philippine state for almost 4 decades. And it seems the peace negotiations with the communist rebels are moving forward very fast. He's also pushing for a more comprehensive peace negotiations with both major Islamist groups, the Moro National and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And I think that also looks quite promising. While at the same time, he wants to make sure that by creating more stability in terms of dealing with insurgency groups, he will have enough energy to also dedicate to the rise of ISIS sympathizer groups like Abu Sayyaf and other extremist Islamist groups who have been gaining ground in the last few weeks. So the point here is, I think Duterte is more of a local politics kind of president. I think he has a lot of similarity to Joko Widodo, the Indonesian president, who in the first 2 years of his office was much more focused on domestic politics than foreign policy. But I think because of the hate verdict, because of the tensions in the South China Sea, he has no choice but to also dedicate more time and diplomatic capital to also deal with China. But I think his purpose here is not confrontation. His purpose here is a proper and peaceful management of the disputes in the South China Sea, because he cannot fight multiple wars at the same time, and his priority is the domestic war on drugs and crime and also on terrorism.
Thank you very much. Of course, China is ready to work with him instead of talking past each other after he delivered the first State of the Union speech. Welcome back. And now, he's accused of violating human rights by encouraging death squads to execute those drug lords and drug pushers in the streets without having to follow the due legal procedures. I mean, that would be a serious violation of human rights. What do you think of his allegation that human rights should be used to protect one's dignity instead of shielding criminality?
Well, he's emphasizing crime and corruption as two of the threats to Filipino society, and that he may have to avoid some of the human rights protections that we might assume police normally would grant to citizens in cracking down on crime. And it's very popular, and he is probably the most powerful president the Philippines has had since President Marcos. And I think in his State of the Nation address, he highlighted those issues because he may be able to deliver them. And I think that's why he didn't mention too much about international relations or issues with China, because I don't think he knows that he can deliver the kind of achievements in foreign policy. So I think there'll be certainly Western NGOs that criticize some of these heavy-handed techniques, but I don't think the Filipino society will be upset about it.
Neither do you think such practice would draw fire from the U.S. government, which talks so much about the human rights record in China? From your perspective.
Next year, when the United States releases its human rights report on the Philippines, they may mention some of the accused extrajudiciary activities by the Duterte's administration. But I believe that the president believes that actually he has the mandate when he got election. And when NGOs criticize him for human rights abuses, well, he believed that most of the Philippine people actually are behind him. So he just resist this kind of criticism. He may believe and show the people in the Philippines that, well, his heavy-handed approach is necessary to carry out his goals of cracking down crimes and drugs. And so he will stress the importance of law and order. And at the same time, of course, he will defend his approach as out of necessity for the law and order in the Philippines.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with Jia Zhoudong and James Ray. We're discussing the State of the Nation speech, the first of its kind since President Duterte took office 2 weeks after he won the campaign. We'll be back in a short while. Gentlemen, he's appointed former President Fidel Ramos as the special envoy of his new administration in resuming negotiations with Beijing about the future of the South China Sea. What do you think of the credibility and leadership of Fidel Ramos?
Former President Ramos is a respected leader of the Philippines and wins respect from the people in China and also the Chinese leaders. Actually, we know that he is a co-chair of the a forum in
the Boer Forum
for Asia Forum, and so over the past the decade, actually he has been working with China very closely to promote regional integration, and so in the process he won his kind of reputation as a leader who is supportive of improved China-Philippines relations. So he's the right person to be appointed to come to China, talk with leaders of China. Of course, actually, he's not when he travels, makes the travel to China. I don't believe that his mission is to negotiate with China, because that negotiation is the job for government officials. He's the former leader, but he will be here to exchange ideas with China, to actually carry a message from the president and to charter the course forward for the bilateral relations, and to exchange with Chinese leaders about the common interests of to de-escalate tensions in the South China Sea and to explore areas of cooperation, greater cooperation between the two countries.
What do you think of the margin for any flexibility between the two sides, the Philippines and China, over the South China Sea?
Well, I think Fidel Ramos is a very good choice, and I think he has the experience and was in position of power in the military and in elected office. I think in terms of President Duterte, I think it's unclear, because I don't think he has the background in foreign policy, and so it'll be up to these choices of advisors. And so far, I think his advisors have been well chosen and accommodating figures. But we don't know if he loses popularity, he may shift to a more confrontational stance that gains nationalist sentiment. He may ultimately fall afoul of the elites in Manila that didn't support his presidency, and might fall to what happened to President Estrada and be removed from office prior to his term ending. And the U.S., as with Marcos, ultimately removed him from power despite his human rights abuses, because he had just become too corrupt. And so if any of these things happen, I think there are many forces that are difficult to navigate in the Philippines, very close to the United States, very unequal and still poor society, and then now this challenge dealing with maritime disputes.
A former and a late Filipino President Corazon Aquino ousted the American troops from the Clark Air Base and the Subic Naval Base after he took office. Now, the United States has regained access to 5 military bases in the Philippines as part of the pivot to Asia to increase its military presence up to perhaps 60%. And that's a formidable counterweight against the alleged Chinese assertiveness in the China Sea. Now, during this process of reconciliation between Manila and Beijing, how likely will it be for President Duterte to mildly advise the Americans, look, if the 5 military bases are still used by the American troops, it might be difficult for Manila to really persuade the Chinese investors in building the far-flung network of a railway is, of course, a part of the infrastructure hunger.
Military presence of the U.S. in the Philippines has been always controversial. There is not actually a consensus about the military presence, given the history of the ups and downs of the U.S. military deployment in the Philippines. And actually, a lot of people in the Philippines knows that China is concerned about the military presence of the U.S. in the Philippines. But however, China does not stand against close security relationship between the two countries, so long as that relationship is not against China. So if the Philippines, the president can handle its security relationship with the United States properly without endangering its relationship with China, that would be fine with China.
Well, James, the Philippines is due to receive its third frigate by November this year under the United States program to transfer excess defense articles. The decommissioned frigate was declared an excess government asset and is being transferred to the Philippines through the excess of defense articles program. What do you think of the importance of having such a frigate that served 50 years in the U.S. Navy, even served the U.S. Navy in the Second World War? Is that just a symbolic gesture?
Well, I would say on the one hand, I think the primary focus of the United States has been Islamic terrorism in the southern Philippines and Abu Sayyaf. I think under the Aquino administration, the feeling was to take a more confrontational approach to China, and so those naval purchases were all occurring under the Aquino administration. I think we'll see under the new administration if those are reversed. And I would also perhaps add in light that in many countries, Southeast Asia, including Philippines, many of the elites are ethnic Chinese who do have a cultural heritage to China, and so I think there is a familiarity and a confidence in building those kind of economic, cultural ties to China. So I think the U.S. position is mostly a strategic relationship, and that can shift with different presidents in charge in the Philippines.
Very quickly, Xiu Dong, what do you think of the frigates to the Philippines? Is that that just a minor part of the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty between Washington and Manila?
The U.S. would like to boost the defense capabilities of the Philippines, but given the financial constraints of the Philippines, actually, it just cannot militarily catch up with China. So it has no chance of winning any war with China. So I believe that actually a kind of military is the approach, is not the solution.
Thanks a lot. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue on the new State of the Nation address by President Duterte of the Philippines. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.